It's a delight to be here today with Professor Ziony Zevit, who is Distinguished Professor of Biblical Literature and Northwest Semitic Languages at the American Jewish University, the University of Judaism. He's been awarded many awards, and there's much to say, but to keep it brief, he's been awarded fellowships by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Lady Davis Fellowship Trust, and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation in 2004. He was awarded the Frank Moore Cross Award by the American Schools of Oriental Research for substantial publications in Near Eastern and Eastern Mediterranean epigraphy texts and traditions, and has written amazing works, is well loved by his many students from all the various places he has and continues to teach. So thank you for taking time
My
to talk.
pleasure to be here.
So I would love to talk with you about monotheism. To start off, how would you define the term monotheism?
Monotheism is usually understood in casual conversation, meaning belief in one God. Generally speaking, monotheism is a word of modern invention. It was invented about 200 years ago, and people started talking about theism and polytheism first, and then they figured, well, if you have polytheism and we're not polytheists, then we must be monotheists. So it's somewhere on this continuum, and the idea is that polytheists believe that there are a lot of gods, and monotheists believe there is only one God. If we want to make it simpler, let's say for every effect, everything that happens, there's a single cause. So we have many subjects and many predicates. In monotheism, as you move farther down the scale, you have one subject, that's to say God, and he has many predicates. So God can do a lot of different things. So that's what monotheism has to do more or less with an orientation to reality. There's a single power that controls everything, or there are many powers that control a lot of different things.
Fascinating. So what's the language that would have been used then when those felt that certain Jewish thinkers were moving too far away from monotheism, pre-modernity? Let's say, for example, theologies that one of panentheism or the like that would have been deemed too, like the Sphirot, those who push back against Sphirot or the like. Like, how would they have described this of being outside of the framework?
That's a great question for which I don't have an answer. I simply don't know how. I don't know that period.
Yeah.
The question, perhaps a question that I'm more comfortable with, is going to be, could we use, or may we use the term monotheism to refer to what people at the time of Bnei Yisrael, when we were living in our land, and before the destruction of the temple, would that have been a proper way of describing them? So now let me give you a rhetorical question, okay? In the book of Judges, Jephthah speaks to the king of Moab, and basically he says, leave me alone. He says, we live in the land that our God gave to us, and you live in the land that your God, Chemosh, gave to you. Was he a monotheist?
Right.
Okay?
Yeah, right. or was that a social way of communicating, of respect? You know?
But that seems to have been the way that things worked. For another example would be in the time of Jeremiah, when the city is about to be destroyed, and people are aware that the city is going to be destroyed, and suddenly he notices that they're offering incense on the roofs to a figure called Malkat HaShamayim, the Queen of the Heavens. And he accuses them of not being loyal to God in his own city, and they're saying, but things aren't working out too well, and things were pretty good before we stopped worshiping Malkat HaShamayim.
Right.
So it means that people were willing to bet that there were different powers that were vying for authority. So I don't think it would be fair to speak of them as monotheists. And there's another word that we can use. The term monolatry means mono, one, and the other word, the second part of that word, has to do with serving. So if you're a monotheist and you're a monolatrist, that means then you're okay. That's what we would call a monotheist. But our ancestors may have been monotheists. They understood that the God of Israel is the God of Israel and our historical deity, but sometimes they hedged their bets And they were monolatrists sometimes, but not all the time, which meant they served God, but they sometimes served other deities. How do we know that? Because the prophets are always inveighing against that, and the book of Shoftim that condemns them, and prophets are condemning them from worshiping other deities.
Yeah. So by the way, we often say casually that Abraham is the first Jew, and Abraham is the inventor of monotheism, and that he is the first to have Brit Milah. But my understanding is that cultures around there were already doing some form of circumcision, and that there also were earlier, actually I don't know the answer to this, but that there were earlier versions of monotheism predating that period as well. Can you speak to that?
Well, the champion of the pre-Abraham monotheism is what was considered a great insult in Egyptian religion, and that was the religion of Akhenaton, who was the predecessor of King Tut. And Akhenaton believed that the sole power in the cosmos was the warmth of the sun, the atom, or the aton. And so during his reign, he did not support the temples of the other deities. In fact, he closed temples. He destroyed some of the inscriptions honoring the other deities because he came to this conclusion that there was a single powerful force from which all other forces derived. There was in that a real monotheistic impulse, but he did not deny the reality of the others. It's just that he arranged the Egyptian pantheon saying, this is sufficient for all of our needs. His beliefs were not particularly popular. They did not, he could control all of the country, but he couldn't control the minds and hearts of the people. And so his reform did not outlast him. We think about it only because Freud wrote this book, Moses and Monotheism, in which Freud argued that even though this belief was no longer accepted in Egypt, it may have influenced Moses, and that's how we got monotheism.
So how did the monotheism of the early Israelites differ from that of their surrounding culture of the Egyptians, in particular with Aten, as you mentioned?
Okay. When there was no Israelite people at the time of this heresy in Egypt. So if Freud is right or was right, and other people, he was following some German scholars of his own day, then it was always underneath. But if we think about it, just even the word that we have, Yud-He Vav-He is the name of God. So we say Adonai. Elohim translates as God. But what does Elohim mean in Hebrew? El means power. Yesh le'el yado. He has power in his hand. So the whole word Elohim, it's a plural of majesty, and it really means power. The insight over here, I think, is that our ancestors have a grasp that there is a singular power that controls everything, and that power may have invented or created nature, but is not in nature. Okay? So God is not in the wind. God may control the wind. God is not in stones. He controls things. So we have a single power, and that is the beginning of monotheism. We have one subject that can have many effects, many predicates.
Fascinating. How much did the early Israelites take from polytheistic cultures around them, like the Babylonians and the Assyrians?
I'm not sure that I can answer the question, but we can take a number of examples. The Babylonians and Assyrians had organized legal systems and courts, okay? And they believed that law was divinely given or divinely authenticated, and that the practice of law was a religious devotional act. That explains part of our attitude towards law. God tells us, more often he's telling us in the Tariag Mitzvot, he's telling us what not to do, which makes sense in jurisprudence.
Yeah.
To give a list of all the things you can do, that's infinite.
Right.
To tell you those things that you shouldn't do or
Right.
can't do, that we begin to see already developing in Babylonian law
Right.
and Assyrian law from the earliest beginnings.
Mm-hmm.
We only begin to come in contact with this during around the 8th, 7th centuries,
Yeah.
when Assyria becomes a power that threatens Israel. So suddenly you become very much aware of the civilization of
Yeah.
these people.
Yeah. So, like, to take one example, like that I've always pointed to, if you'll tell me if it's correct, is that in the Code of Hammurabi, to kill a slave is a monetary crime, whereas in the Torah it's a capital crime. How do you understand like such a moral development occurring at a time period like that?
This again, that's a great question.
Yeah.
It has to do with people looking out in the world, looking out in the cosmos.
Yeah.
Our ancestors, in a very important way, are a real people.
Yeah.
But if you want to think of them as a real people, not only think of them as a social group,
Right.
a lot of individual tribes that may fight and bicker, like a
Yeah.
lot of brothers and sisters in big families may fight and bicker. But there's a certain type of self-think. They all think alike. They all share certain values. And among the values are the values of human rights.
Yeah.
Another good example, I think, was pointed out by a fellow named Jerry Unterman in a book that he wrote on ethics in the biblical period. And he showed in the Torah, we have many laws concerning the ger. The ger is the stranger,
Right.
the non-Israelite who happens to settle among you
Yeah.
with your permission.
Yeah.
Once that person is there, he is essentially just like you in terms of civil rights.
It's not a conversion. It's not a citizenship. If they live within your communal space, basically.
Yeah, because you've allowed them
Right,
there, and
right.
therefore they have the same rights as you.
Right.
Slaves, most of the slaves in Israel
Yeah.
were debt slaves. That's to say, the Israelite who suddenly had to sell himself
Right.
to cover his debts.
Yeah.
So he's just like you.
Right.
He's going to get out of his slavery at some point, and
Yeah.
then he's going to be your equal and everything else. Why would you want to treat him
Right.
harshly?
Right.
In Mesopotamia, killing a slave was killing a piece of your property.
Yeah.
Egypt, incidentally, and it's very interesting, stopped using slavery, domestic slavery, at a very early stage of its civilization. It only used slaves that it captured in war, and then generally, most likely, worked them to death. Because you didn't want your former enemy soldiers running around around your country.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so a meta question: How might our understanding of Israelite culture's interaction with other surrounding cultures influence the way we understand the Torah today?
Well, our understanding of the Torah today has to do with not so much the influence of the civilizations that existed around the time the
Yeah.
Torah itself came into
Right.
existence,
Yeah.
about the civilizations that our ancestors were in exile. So where were the main exilic communities? One was in Mesopotamia. And in Mesopotamia, beginning with pagans, but after a while under Islam.
Yeah.
And in Egypt also, under the Persians, and then again later under Islam. So at that particular point in time, we began to understand our way of life as an eternally given nomos, a sort of a law that was given on us. We no longer spoke of folkways. In other words, separating meat and milk, or eating these animals and not those animals. This was already a given for us. It wasn't a custom. It was no longer a matter of custom. It had divine stamp of authority, just as they were different from us, we were different from them, and we liked making them others, and we enjoyed being others ourselves. When other cultures began to record their laws and develop the interpretations of their laws, we begin to undergo and do a similar process. Why? It doesn't matter that they were there. They may have been doing it first, because it's a good idea, and it only enhances the quality of our life and our existence. So that's where the big influences come. In the biblical period, some of our ancestors are worshiping Baal. Some of them are worshiping Asherah. There's also references to Anat, the goddess Anat. These are all well-known Canaanite god names. We just got through Tishrei, well, Tishrei is a Babylonian month name, and it's a Babylonian word, and it refers to the beginning. Okay, so it's okay. So a lot of our month names actually are all Babylonian month names. So we adopted that just because it's a technical innovation that made more sense than going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now we have January, February, March, and we're all complete.
Great. Okay, so my last question for you then is, in modernity, when monotheism becomes an idea or becomes a word that we're using in this way, we also talk about ethical monotheism, which is to imply that ethics are not necessarily a part of monotheism itself. It's a theological assumption. But I wonder, to what extent do you understand the relationship between monotheism and ethics? Plato famously argued that if you have multiple gods, you have multiple sources of truth, multiple ethical truths, whereas a monotheism would mean one ethical truth. But I wonder, either historically or even today, how you understand a monotheistic commitment's relationship to an ethical commitment.
I think, again, it has to go through the way we have chosen to tell our story about ourselves. We, as Jews, see ourselves today, here and now, as ethical people. We try to be ethical, and if we're not always ethical, at least we support people who are ethical, who will scold us. We read back our ethics. Basically, when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about making decisions that enhance the quality of our community's life, and we expand the borders of our community to include the people among whom we are living and more distant. In other words, the other becomes part of our responsibility because we're engaged within the other. The rabbis, in particular, took the ancestors and turned each of them into an ethical paradigm.
Right.
So we just finished Sukkot. So you have the Ushpizin.
Yes, exactly.
Okay?
Right.
Well, remember who you're inviting to be your first guest at the table, Abraham, who was about to slaughter his son Isaac. Okay?
Right.
So, but as we tell the story to ourselves, we don't only use the biblical text, we also use the rabbinic interpretations of the text. And under those conditions, Abraham is a model of ethical obedience pushed to a very far edge, but it becomes a paradigm, and so too all of the others on the list, even to Yosef HaTzadik.
Beautiful. Well, friends, check out Professor Ziony Zevit's wonderful works, and thank you very much for this time. Fascinating stuff.